Chapter 2. Jeff debarked from the plane at Charleston as the sun was going down. The crowd of people from the plane hurried, and he let himself be carried along by them. It was hot, so hot he was not surprised to see palm trees along the cyclone fencing that bordered the runways. Hotter because he wore his school uniform to travel in, the gray flannel pants and blue blazer, the white shirt and striped tie. He moved along with the crowd toward a pink one-story building with a glass tower on top of it, the airport. The sky over this flat countryside was soaked with the colors of the setting sun, and Jeff stepped out of the line of traffic to look at it for a minute. A hot reddish gold shone at the horizon and faded out to orange-pink about a third of the way up the arc of the sky. The flower-like heads of the taller palm trees turned into black silhouettes to the west. Wispy stray clouds drifted across the western sky. Jeff found the baggage claim area without trouble by following the general drift of traffic. Unlike the Baltimore airport an hour and a half to the north of him, this airport would be hard to get lost in. "Melody will meet you," the professor had told him as they'd waited for Jeff's plane to be announced. "Just let me know when you're returning and I'll pick you up," he had said. Jeff had the return portion of his ticket paid for, but the flight unspecified, in the pocket of his blazer. He had shaken the professor's hand, and he had not looked back as he walked through the passageway to his plane. He didn't even look back to see if the professor had waited for him to look back. And once you were on your plane, it was impossible to see into the plate glass of windows of the observation area if there was someone watching for you or not. At the luggage claim, Jeff picked out his father's battered leather suitcase and went to the waiting area. This was a big room, with 2 long walls of windows and 2 short walls of ticket counters. He sat on a plastic chair, his suitcase at his feet. Outside the window to the runway, the sun went down and the sky turned dark. Outside the opposite window, cars pulled up, their twin headlights unnecessary on the brightly lit unloading area. People moved through the big air-conditioned room, some arriving, some leaving, meeting and parting. A voice overhead announced planes. Jeff waited. He had $30 in his pocket, $20 from his father and $10 from Brother Thomas to bring back a bottle of local wine. Jeff kept an eye on his suitcase and on the clock. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't tired. He waited. And he waited. The room was less crowded now, and the twin headlights drove up less frequently. The air grew quiet, except for an occasional low-toned conversation. Jeff sat motionless, his legs side by side, his hand in his lap, his mind empty, and waited. A rush of sweet air washed around him, enveloped him, a voice murmuring, half laughing, half sad, "Oh, Jeffy, Jeffy." He closed his eyes as his cheek came to rest on her shoulder and her flowery scent flowed around him. Her arms wrapped around him and he could feel her hands on his back. He tried to grab at all the sensations at once, the sound of her voice, honey sweet with its lazy vowels. "I'm so sorry to be so late. It doesn't matter. I was just afraid you'd give up on me and go back. And then there was a traffic jam and, oh, my little boy." Her arms around him, holding him close, the perfumed air she carried with her, he remembered. "But let me look at you. Aren't you going to kiss me? Haven't you missed me? Aren't you going to hug me? Jeffy, are you angry? Don't be angry at me." He lifted his head and opened his eyes. "You're all grown up," she said. One hand stayed on his shoulder. The other touched his cheek, brushed his hair back from his forehead. It was like the sunshine on the first day of real spring. "Look at you, grown up, but you look pale. Oh, Jeffy, have you been terribly unhappy?" Her eyes filled with tears, which flowed down over her cheeks in a thin line. "I'm so happy to see you," she said, touching his cheek again. Jeff's heart hurt him. It was so full of the warmth and sweetness. The warmth seemed to run along his bloodstream. He felt his eyes fill with tears. She smiled. "Not so grown up after all, are you?" "I'm glad." She smiled right into his eyes. Jeff felt his mouth quiver. "But aren't you going to say anything? Haven't you got anything to say?" Her lips brushed his cheek. The palm of her soft hand held his other cheek, and his heart thudded so painfully in his chest that he knew if he had to stand, his legs would be too weak to support him. "Say something," she insisted. Every painful beat of Jeff's heart was saying something, Mommy, but he couldn't speak. Then at least sit back and let me look at you. He held both of his hands in both of hers and sat staring at him. He stared back. Well, what do you think of me? She finally asked. Beautiful, Jeff said. His voice croaked a little, so he cleared his throat and said it again. You're beautiful. He felt like a man must, who has been kept in a dungeon for years and years, and he steps out into the sunlight for the first time. He couldn't possibly have said what he felt. She was beautiful too, so beautiful she took his breath away. Her long black hair curved smoothly down along the sides of her face until it was gathered back to form in a gleaming circle at the top of her head. Her eyes. He had forgotten how dark the outer circle of gray in her eyes was and how the lighter gray shone within that circle. Her black eyelashes framed her eyes, and her curved black eyebrows made another circle. Her oval face, her small straight nose, her smiling mouth, the high cheekbones, and the tanned skin. I'd forgotten how beautiful you are, he said. She laughed, a sound like honey, and stood up, still holding on to both of his hands. He stood in front of her, noticing vaguely that she wore a dress, and noticing clearly how small her waist was, how long and slender her tanned arms and legs. Oh, Mommy, he said, and he reached up to hug her, wrapping his arms around her neck, just as he now remembered he had done when he was little, before she went away. She held him close to her. The top of his head came to her ears. You're tall, she said. Jeff shook his head. I think you're short, he corrected her. At that, she laughed again and stepped back while the sound still sang in his ears. Get your suitcase. The car's outside and parked where it's illegal. Didn't you have any pictures of me? Jeff held his suitcase at the end of one arm. She tucked her hand under the other arm and kept looking at him. But your father must have a couple. Didn't you ask him? Jeff shook his head. You goose, she smiled at him, like sunlight again. He had been afraid she would be angry. You silly, silly goose. We'll have to give you some. And take some of you for me. I almost didn't recognize you. I had to study you for a minute. You're so different. Then I saw the suitcase. I thought you'd be looking for me, she said. I'm sorry, Jeff said. I was just waiting. He had hurt her feelings, so he added quickly, It doesn't matter. I don't care. And everything's all right now, she said. I'm here, and you're here, and we're back together again. I'm so happy, she said, her voice singing the words as they stepped out into the night air. She made Jeff sit in the back seat of the car, an old 4-door sedan. Children should always sit in the back, she said to him, and strap yourself in. Children are so light. If there's a wreck, they fly around inside of the car. The back is the safest place. He did what she asked gladly. He sat in the right-hand corner where he could look across to her as she drove. I have to make a stop, she said, pulling out onto the highway. Do you mind? No. Jeff wouldn't mind anything. How do you like Charleston? I don't know. I haven't seen any of it. She laughed again, as if he had said something funny. He thought he ought to ask her a question, so he did. Is this your car? No, heavens, I don't have enough money to buy a car. A friend of mine lets me use it when he's out of town. I couldn't afford to insure a car. I can barely afford to buy gas. But I don't mind. Detroit doesn't have any of my money, and neither do the fat cat oil companies most of the time. And that keeps my personal pollution contribution down. Jeff was remembering more about her with every minute. He watched her hands on the steering wheel and wondered about the rings she wore. The lights overhead and from passing trucks flashed over her hands, lighting them purple and yellow. She turned off the highway after a few minutes and negotiated a number of turns before stopping in front of a small, one-story house, one in a row of similar houses, each with a chain-link fence around it. She turned around in her seat to ask, Do you want to wait in the car or come in? I'll wait, Jeff decided. You better come in. We may be a while, she told him. She opened the low gate for them and then took his arm again as they went up the walk to the small porch. A yellow light covered with the bodies of bugs shone over the door. Inside, 2 women sat at the kitchen table, folding letters into a pile of envelopes. Most of the house was taken up by this kitchen, which had the sofa at the wall farthest from the stove and sink, with a small TV set on the coffee table. Mel, the women said, we were wondering where you were. I was meeting someone, Jeff's mother said. The man in my life. Let me introduce him. Jefferson Green. This is Phoebe. Hello, Jeff said to a young woman whose short, curly, dark hair framed her face. Phoebe nodded at him. And Willa. Jeff said hello to Willa, whose brown hair curled like Phoebe's into fuzzy curls. Sit down, Jeffy. My goodness, his mother told him. He sat obediently in one of the 2 empty chairs at the table. She took the other. My son, she announced. Jeff stared at her. She had sounded so proud and glad as she said that. Her big eyes moved from one to the other of the people at the table. A smile teased at her mouth. "For heaven's sakes," Phoebe said, "you never said a word." Both of the women stared at Jeff. "From the marriage?" Willa said. "Oh, yes," Melody said. "I had to pick him up at the airport, and I was late and so worried. I can't tell you." She pressed her hand over her heart. Talk about anxiety. Melody did not wear a wedding ring, Jeff noticed, but she wore 2 silver rings with a piece of turquoise set in them on one hand. On the other hand, she wore a big ring with a dark red stone in it and a plain pearl ring. Her fingers were delicate. "We'd better get going on this if we want to do a mailing tomorrow. Jeffy will help, won't you?" "It's a women's lib material," she teased. "Sure," Jeff said. "Doesn't make any difference to me." Melody's laugh floated over the table. "But it will, Jeffy, it will. You just wait." They folded the letters into envelopes. This was the second of 5 mailings. "And we've got to get all the facts and figures," Melody said, her hands working. "For all the good it does," Phoebe said. "I don't know. Sometimes I think women just don't care." "What do you expect?" Melody asked. "When we've all been brought up to get married and let a man support us." "Well, it serves them right," Willa said. "Sometimes I think I'll do just that. It would certainly be easier than earning the money and keeping the house, too. Especially when I think of the men who earn more than I do and don't work as hard, or as well. It's just what they deserve, some women hanging like a leech off of them. Then they complain about women." "The trouble with that," Melody said, her voice serious and sad, "is that it's bad for you. Bad for women to do that. Bad for themselves, because it just perpetuates things. We have to fight for our self-respect, don't we?" The other 2 women nodded in agreement. "And if we don't do something," Melody went on, "if people like us don't try to do something to change it, then we're contributing to it. If you think about it, we are. Why, I wouldn't take a job working for a man for all the tea in China." "Yes, but you've got a family to live with," Willa told her. "And an ex-husband," Phoebe said. "My goodness, you don't think I'd take a penny from him?" Jeff's mother said, angry. "I'm insulted. Yes, insulted that you'd think that, and then work with me on this campaign. Why, I have more self-respect than that, and so should you." They apologized, and after a few minutes, Melody's voice resumed its ordinary tones. Lazy, full of subdued laughter, Jeff relaxed. It was late when they left, the streets deserted, most of the little houses dark. They got back onto the expressway and drove for several miles. Melody yawned and asked Jeff how he had liked the 2 women. He said he had liked them all right. "They're so young," she said, "barely over 20, both of them. It's good for the young women to learn from the beginning the fight they'll have to make if they're not going to be taken advantage of. It's worse here in the South," she said. "It's much worse." "I guess so," Jeff agreed. Sleep hung on his eyelids and pulled at his shoulders. He barely noticed when his mother parked the car in front of a tall house. He noticed only that he stumbled on uneven bricks as they walked to the front door. Inside, she let him up a broad staircase and opened a door for him with her finger on her lips. "We don't want to wake them up. They sleep lightly," she said. "Oh, Jeffy, I'm so happy to have you here with me. Sleep well until the morning," she said softly, and kissed him on the forehead. Jeff peeled off his clothes and stripped back the spread from the bed before lying down on it in just his underpants. He was too tired to look for his pajamas, too tired to see where he should put his clothes away. He turned off the bedside light and lay dazzled and bemused in the darkness before slipping into sleep. He woke early, but without any sense of strangeness. His room, he sat up in the bed and looked around him, was large and square, airy. All 4 windows were open and the gauzy curtains hung still in the motionless air. He heard, beyond the silence of the house around him, an occasional motor, an occasional bird, no human voices. He had to go to the bathroom badly, but he didn't know where it was. He sat up and curled his legs underneath him. His bed had 4 tall posts, 4 fluted, slender poles, each with an acorn carved at its tip. The walls of the room were white, faded to a kind of pearly color. The high ceilings had cracks running along it. The floor was broad boards of wood. A dresser stood next to one bare wall, with a mirror set on it and a large dark wood wardrobe beside it. Under the windows on one wall stood a little writing table with a chair pulled up to it. Jeff's bed was placed between 2 windows. He saw only one door. He really had to go to the bathroom. He hadn't been since he was on the plane. Jeff got out of bed and unpacked his bag, hanging his trousers and dress shirt carefully in the wardrobe. He He refolded his underpants and t-shirt into the drawers of the dresser and made neat piles of his jeans and shorts. He placed his brush and comb on the dresser top, putting his toothpaste and toothbrush down beside them. He selected the drawer he would use for soiled clothing, dropped yesterday's clothes into it, and dressed in flannels and a shirt. He wondered how early it was and where the bathroom was. He went to a window and looked out over little patches of bright flower gardens and bright green lawns to the back of 3 other sleeping houses. The air hung moist and cool around him. It came sweet and warm into his lungs. Very early, he guessed. 2 of the houses were brick. All of them had a second-story veranda, and he wondered if he might push back the screen and pee out the window. Of course, he couldn't do that, and he wouldn't, but the idea made him smile. He forced himself to open the door of his room. His bare feet made no noise on the wooden floor of the half-lit hall. On one long wall, tall lace-curtained windows and 2 lace-curtained French doors opened onto a veranda. His room was at the far end. The broad staircase they had ascended the night before was at the center, where it turned to mount up another flight. There were 2 doors on his half of the hall and 2 on the far half. One of them had to be a bathroom. Jeff stood, trying to decide which it might be. He thought the second door on his side of the stairs was closer to the staircase than the second door on the far side, which made him guess that was the bathroom. The closeness might mean a smaller room. If he was wrong, if, for instance, it was his mother's bedroom, how would she feel if he opened the door and woke her up? Or worse, her family's bedroom door, some total stranger. Jeff silently argued with himself that perhaps he didn't have to go to the bathroom after all, but he did, and badly. He opened the door next to his, gently turning the white porcelain handle, gently pushing the heavy door inward. It was, he saw with a rush of relief that brought tears to his eyes and was immediately dominated by intense pressure on his bladder, a bathroom. While he was there, he washed his face in a quiet trickle of water. He would have liked to take a bath in the long tub, but decided he ought not to. He rubbed cold water over his teeth with a forefinger until they squeaked because he had forgotten to bring his toothbrush and toothpaste. Then he returned to his own room. There he put on socks and shoes, brushed his hair, made the bed, and sat down on it. Except for the items on top of the dresser, nobody would know he was there. He hadn't disturbed anything. The light in the room grew brighter as the sun moved up the sky. The sounds outside the window grew louder and more frequent. An odor of bacon rose into his room from somewhere below. He heard footsteps on the stairs. The temperature in his room mounted. He sat with his hands in his lap. After a while, the door of his room burst open. "What are you doing?" Melody asked him. "We've all eaten. Why don't you come down?" Jeff looked at her. She wore her hair in one thick braid down her back. She wore sandals on her feet and a pink sundress. Her eyes looked cross. Her pink mouth was not smiling. "Just like your father. Come on down, Jeffy. Jambo wants to meet you. We've all been waiting." "Honestly, you goose." She smiled at him then and held out her hand. Jeff hurried to take it and hold it. "Nobody will eat you." She smiled into his eyes. Her perfume was fresher than the early morning air had been, sweeter. They descended the broad staircase and she led him into a dining room where a white-haired woman with liquid brown eyes and loops of pearls over the bodice of her lacy blouse stared at him down the length of the table. On either side of her sat 2 aged women who also stared at him. They all had breakfast placed in front of them, stained with egg yolk. Melody pulled Jeff down the length of the table. "Jambo?" He was awake and dressed, and he didn't know what to do, I guess. "This is my little boy, Jefferson Green. Jeffy, this is Jambo, my grandmother. It's about time you 2 met," she said, stepping back. Jeff smiled politely. "Hello," he said. "It's very nice of you to let me come and visit." She looked up at him, and he was alarmed to see all of the sentiment in her eyes. "You may kiss me," she said, and he bent to kiss her cheek. "Sit there." She waved him to the seat opposite her. "Since you're the man of the house, you must be hungry." Jeff sat. Melody left the room to get him some breakfast. The table was covered with a white linen cloth. A china bowl in which pink camellias floated decorated the center. A long-stemmed glass of ice water was set at Jeffy's place, and heavy silver utensils. Melody came back in with a plate for him and a glass of orange juice, and a miniature rack where 2 slices of toast seemed to stand at attention. She sat at the 5th chair beside one of the 2 aged women, a place where there was no silver or napkin set out. "Jambo is my mother's mother," she told Jeff. "Go ahead and eat before the eggs get cold, and this," she indicated the women beside her who twittered words Jeff couldn't hear but seemed to be smiling at him, "is Aunt Booty, and that," the woman on the opposite side, who ducked her head in a nervous gesture, "is Aunt Dodo, and that's all the family." Jeff smiled and nodded and started to eat. Jambo, then, would be his great-grandmother. She didn't look old enough to be a great-grandmother. Her hair was thick and healthy-looking, her skin wrinkled, but not with the same crepey look that the aunts' faces had. Her eyes seemed lively and interested as she stared at him. The other 2 wore sweaters, even in the warmth of the room, and he peered at him through glasses as if even then they couldn't really see him. He ate 2 fried eggs, 6 slices of bacon, and fried potatoes. Melody reached out and took a piece of toast, buttered it, and put it on his plate for him. A white-haired black woman came into the room to pour coffee into 3 cups. His mother got up and followed her out of the room to return with her own cup of coffee. Jeff guessed Melody had eaten breakfast in the kitchen. When he put his fork down on the empty plate, his mother asked him, "Had enough?" She had watched him eat as if she too were enjoying every mouthful. "And what are you 2 children going to do today?" Jambo asked. "I'd like to show Jeffy Charleston," Melody answered, "and get to know him again." "That's all right," Jambo said. "We'll talk later then, Jefferson. After all, I have some rights in you too. You're the last of my line, and I expect you know very little of your family. Tell me, is that correct?" Her voice was low, soft, and slow. Jeff nodded his head. "I'm very glad to see you here in my house at last," Jambo said, "except for, I don't like to say critical things, and at the breakfast table too, but a gentleman," she looked at him seriously down the length of the table, "always lowers the toilet seat after," she added, coughing gently into her napkin, rising from the table before Jeff had time to answer. "I'm awfully sorry," he said as she approached him. "We all make mistakes." She smiled down at him and reached out one hand to touch the top of his head. She wore a thin wedding band and a big diamond on that hand. Her hand was gentle as a bird's wing on Jeff's hair. "I suspect nobody ever taught you any better." She slid her hand under Jeff's chin and lifted his face to study it. "He's a handsome boy, Melody. He has that Beaudralt look to him." "Yes," Jeff's mother said, pride in her voice. The 2 women looked at each other over the top of Jeff's head. He knew he had done something right, and he was glad for Melody's sake. "Ready to go outside?" Melody asked him. "Don't you want to see my old hometown?" Jeff jumped up from his seat and said a general farewell, and followed his mother to the front door where she waited him, a broad-brimmed straw hat on her head. The streamers, like the flowers on her sundress, were pink. She took his arm as they stepped outside. The air was moist and warm, filled with sunlight. Melody led him down a narrow brick path, bounded by Jambo's house on one side and a tall whitewashed wall on the other, and into the street. They turned toward the sun and walked. The street was quiet, the houses, many of them like Jambo's, set sideways to the street, tall. Their lawns were hidden behind walls, but the gates were left open, and Jeff caught glimpses of tall trees with broad, shiny leaves, hedges of azaleas, beds of rose bushes, and white wrought iron furniture. His stride matched his mother's, and they moved slowly down the shady sidewalk. The street, with those courtyard-like lawns and narrow alleys leading off unexpectedly, with the houses opulent even when they had fallen into disrepair. With sun-drenched air, the street seemed foreign to Jeff, ancient and mysterious. He looked up at the shuttered first-floor windows and wondered about the people who lived in those houses. They walked down to a broad park at the end of a tip of land. This park was ringed with trees, crossed by sidewalks, circled by a 4-laned road. They passed a monument to the Civil War dead. "This is Battery Park," Melody told him. "This whole section is called the Battery. It's the heart of the city. But you'll get more than enough history from Jambo." She laughed, and her smile poured into Jeff's eyes. They walked along one end of the park, ran across the road, and climbed a set of cement steps to an elevated walkway that ran along the harbor. "That's the Ashley River coming in," Melody said. "And over there," she walked in that direction, "is the Cooper. You can see Fort Sumter." She stood still and pointed. Jeff looked obediently to where he could see a brief dark line on the horizon. They continued walking at a lazy pace, Melody's hand tucked under his forearm. At the end of the walkway, they leaned against the railing and looked out over the water. Here, a breeze stirred, blowing down from the land across the river's mouth. "What do you think?" Melody asked Jeff. He looked at her profile and couldn't find words. "You must think something," she insisted. Her mouth curved up in a smile. "Beautiful," he said. He was about to say more when she interrupted him. "That's Aunt Booty's name, or rather Belle is, but when my mother was little, she called her Booty from Beauty and the Beast, and it stuck. It's crazy, isn't it? There is something crazy about the South. You know that, don't you?" "No," Jeff said. "The land of lost causes," his mother said. "But what I really wanted was for you to look at the river here." Jeff looked down and across to where what seemed to be an aircraft carrier was moored upriver. "Is that an aircraft carrier?" he asked. "Boys," Melody sighed. "Yes, there's a big naval base. Carriers and nuclear subs go out of Charleston. I hope you don't want me to take you over to the boats. I hope you don't expect that." "No," Jeff said. He didn't expect anything. "What I wanted you to see was the water. See how green it is? You know what that means. There are factories, refineries too, upriver, and they've killed the river." "Killed it," she repeated. "It used to be you could fish in this river, and it ran brown with mud, and turtles stuck their heads up so many that they looked like grass. Herons lived in the marshes, crabs and clams." "Not anymore," she said. "I don't know whether to get angry or just weep. And I'll tell you something else. The Chesapeake Bay is worse." She turned to face him. "Do you know what Captain John Smith said about the Chesapeake Bay? He said it teemed with fish, so all a man had to do was step into its water with his sword out, and a fish would leap onto it and he could feast. You've seen it. What do you think?" Jeff thought about the harbor in Baltimore, where tankers lined up at piers edged with high brick warehouses, and he remembered Sparrow Point, where the air was thick with industrial pollution. "It smells much worse than this," he said. "Only because the air's right today," Melody told him. "When the wind comes down from the refineries and plants, it stinks. No, it really stinks. But you're right, things are better down here. And do you know why? It's because it's a poor country, the South. Poverty may save it. That's ironic, don't you think? The only thing that saves what's left of the ecology down here is because we're too poor to develop, I think. If I didn't know about the victim of that poverty, I'd be grateful for it. But I don't think, in the long run, anything will save us." Her hair hung long and black in the braid down her back, gleaming in the sunlight. "Let's sit down in the shade," Melody said. She led him back down the steps and across the street and across the park to a bench facing the row of houses that faced out over the harbor. These were missions with verandas on all 3 floors, with curved staircases leading up to their broad front doors. They were the kinds of houses that might welcome women in hoop skirts and gentlemen in tall boots. The ancient trees around them were twisted, broad-branched, and hung with Spanish moss. "We can really talk," Melody said. "Are you still at the university school?" She sat close enough beside him to hold on to his hand. "Yes, I'm going into 7th grade. That's the year I was going to take you out because no girls can enroll. Is that still true? No girls after 6th grade?" Jeff sensed that she wanted him to talk about school, but he was bemused by sensations and couldn't chatter. He felt as if he had been cold, frozen down to his bones and into the marrow, and suddenly now he lay under the warmth of the sun. He could feel himself growing easy, relaxed under the warmth. He couldn't distract himself from the enjoyment of that. It had something to do with the way his mother held his hand, held to his arm when they walked, touched him with her glance. His sensations were half-remembered, memory growing stronger with every minute he was with her. "How do you do at school?" "All right, I get some B's, mostly C's." "B's without working or B's with working?" she asked. "With working," he said. The silver and turquoise rings looked wrong on her hand, too big and clumsy for her fingers. "Oh dear, you must have gotten my brains, not your father," she said. "Poor Jeffy. Is that hard on you?" "No," he said. "I don't mind." She laughed. "I never did myself. His brains don't do him much good, do they? I remember when you left for school for your first day. Do you remember?" He shook his head. You were quiet, but you weren't frightened. After all, you'd been in daycare for years. I even remember the first time I ever saw you. In the hospital. Oh, Jeffy. I never even suspected what it would be like having a baby. They tell you, but you never take it in. I thought I'd died and gone to hell. The pain and the horrible bright lights and the sterile box walls with machines on them and the nurses who didn't care about what you were going through. I dream about it sometimes. I'm sorry, Jeff said. Then, when they brought you to me after I came out of the anesthetic, this little baby, so little and helpless, your eyes were open, but you couldn't see anything really. I knew that. Your fingers were all curled up, and then when I nursed you, she looked up at him. Does that embarrass you? No, Jeff lied. Then I knew that none of the pain mattered a whit, as long as you were the result of it. It was like 10 Christmases all at once. I couldn't breathe properly. Her voice caressed the memory. I didn't mind that or the bleeding. None of it could make even a dent in my happiness. Sometimes I think that was the happiest time of my life. And we were always together for as long as I could. We'd go everywhere together. You'd look at me with your big eyes. You'd only look at me, always. Your eyes have changed, she observed. Jeff didn't know what to say. I'm so glad to see you again, Melody declared. You don't know how I've missed you. Have you missed me? Was it very terrible for you? Is it still? No, I don't think I really want to hear about that. It'll just make me feel more guilty. And besides, it's all behind us now, isn't it? Yes, was all Jeff could say. Come on, why are we sitting here? I want to show you my city. You can walk for hours and never see it all. Come on, Jeffy. They ambled up streets and down alleys, through a church graveyard and along a business street where they peered into windows of antique shops. She showed him the oldest part of the city, where houses built in the Revolutionary times were being renovated. At last they stopped at a small restaurant for something to drink. Melody wanted to sit outside. The glass top tables were small, the chairs set on uneven bricks, the area roofed over by a rough wooden trellis over which grapevines had been trained. They sat in dappled sunlight. Their table had a little vase of fresh daisies on it. The napkins were linen. Brick walls enclosed the garden. Melody studied the handwritten menu. Jeff studied her. She looked at him mischievously over the top and asked if he wasn't hungry, because she was. They ordered sandwiches and iced tea, which Melody said was very good here. Do you like it? Melody asked him as he ate his sandwich. It's good. No, you silly goose, the restaurant. It's my absolute favorite for lunch. I'd eat here every day if I could afford it. Do you? Very much. Why? She asked him. Her gray eyes were teasing. Well, Jeffy, you don't say very much, and I really do want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to pry into your secret thoughts, so I thought, if he'll talk to me about the scenery, then I can hear what he has to say. Jeff, who felt by this time as if all the hard frozen places within him had melted away, smiled happily back at her. I like it, the way I like Jambo's house and everything we've seen today, because it looks as if somebody has taken the trouble to make it pretty, and it's lasted such a long time. It makes my eyes feel good because it's the same way you look. A compliment? Then you're not disappointed in me? Jeff just shook his head. But don't you have any questions? There should be so many questions you want to ask me, and you haven't asked me any. Not one. As if she had summoned them up, Jeff realized that he did have questions. Answers he badly wanted to hear. Yes, he said. Then ask them, for heaven's sakes. What do you think I'm here for? How old are you? He asked. Oh dear, the worst first. She smiled across the table at him. I'm 32. What do you think of that? Then you were 20 when I was born. Isn't that young? She leaned her chin on her hands and nodded her head. He had the feeling she wanted to laugh at him, but if she did, her laughter would be friendly. How tall are you? 5, 6 and a half. Where did you go? Home. Here. I came right here, and I've been here ever since. I grew up here. Jambo raised me. Well, from the time I was 9. This is my real home. What about your parents? My daddy was killed in the Second World War, and after a few years, my mother remarried. He was a nice enough man, I guess, but they moved up to Minnesota. We all did, and he didn't have any luck. One summer when I was 8, I visited Jambo, and I was so happy. There wasn't all the worry about money and keeping jobs, and to make it worse, my mother had a couple of children in the meantime. I don't know. It was what you said, as if somebody had taken so much trouble to make things look nice. So I asked Jambo if I could live with her. It didn't matter how much it cost because she's rich. And we got along so well, she sort of adopted me. I'm the only young person in her family, so it'll all come to me someday anyway. I thought you said your mother was her daughter. She is, otherwise how could Jambo be my grandmother? But didn't you say there were other children, so you have brothers and sisters or something, Jeff said. Melody shrugged. Maybe, I don't know. They don't keep in touch, and they're not the same kind of people at all. Jambo's never even seen them. Why not? My mother never brought them here. Well, she couldn't afford the journey. Not on what he makes, so as far as Jambo's concerned, I'm the only one. More questions? How old were you when you married the professor? 19. I dropped out of school. He was my teacher in the World History Survey course. That takes me back. It really takes me back. Why did you go away? Jeff finally asked. Oh, Jeffy. She reached across to put the palm of her hand against his cheek. There were so many reasons. What does the professor tell you? Jeff couldn't answer. That irritated her, so he said quickly, I never asked him. We never talk about you. At that, she laughed again and clapped her hands together. Isn't that like him? Just exactly like him. I thought I could save him. I thought I could wake him up, but I never could. Nobody ever could. That's what I think now. Look, she suggested, you just got here. You don't know me. You ought to get to know me and then see what you think. Whether I could have been happy with him. Okay? Okay. Is that all the questions? After all this time? Well, what are those rings? She held her right hand out. These, she touched the turquoise with her fingertip, were given to me by a man I'm dating. You'll like him. I hope you'll like him. It's his car. And this one, the old-fashioned looking ring with the reddish stone, I found in an antique store. I thought it might be worth something if the stone was ruby and the dealer didn't have any idea of what she had. She was just some old lady who didn't know anything. She had no business being in business. I felt so sorry for her, so I bought it on speculation. But when I had it valued, she threw her hands up empty. But it's $100 ring I got for $3. And that one? She spread her hands out on the tabletop. The pearl Jambo gave me for my 16th birthday. It was one of hers. Jeff looked at her hands, the fingernails glistening with clear polish. The nails shaped the delicate bones of her wrist. He reached across and put his own hand over hers, surprised at himself for doing it. You have beautiful hands, he said to her. She understood what he was feeling, what he really wanted to say to her. I love you too, she answered him. Melody had left her purse behind, so Jeff paid for the lunch out of the $20 of his own money. The bill came to $12, to which Melody insisted that he add a $3 tip. Do you know what waitresses get paid in places like this? $1.50 an hour, and the owners get away with it because it's not a big enough business to require minimum wage, so they depend on tips. Jeff took the change he had just been given out of his wallet. Were you a waitress? No, but I know some people who were, and part of it is because they're women. They get away with paying women less, and the poor women just take it. I don't want you to be like that, Jeffy. Jeff nodded his agreement. He would try. He felt guilty that he had never thought of it before. Back at Jambo's house, Melody took him into the kitchen and introduced him to the black woman who was working out there, Miss Opal. The kitchen, back behind the house and attached to it by a short hallway, was a low-ceilinged dark room, its temperature even higher than outside because of the heat from the big range. Miss Opal had set out 2 trays for the old ladies, she said. They wanted afternoon tea in their rooms so they would be rested up for the celebration dinner in young Jefferson's honor. Miss Melody, she said, had had several phone calls. The messages were written down. Melody told Jeff that her friends didn't believe she had a son. They didn't believe she was taking some days off just to be with him. She guessed she wouldn't bother returning those calls too quickly because she had told them she wouldn't be available to help out. She told him to wait there. She would go up and get her guitar, then they would sit outdoors. I'll serenade you. When they were settled outdoors, Jeff said, I didn't know you played the guitar, as he watched her tune the strings. "I just started," she told him. She sat cross-legged, her feet tucked up under her bright skirt, her hat set beside her on the grass. Jeff lay on his stomach, resting his chin on his folded arms so he could look at her. She watched her own hands as she played and sang. "What kind of songs do you like?" she asked him. Jeff couldn't tell her anything. She forgave him that and simply played what she wanted. Her songs were mostly sad. "Where have all the flowers gone?" one asked. Then, "Where have all the young men gone?" They all had gone to war and been destroyed, so the song asked, "When will they ever learn?" She sang a song about a calf being taken to market, a song with a refrain in the voice of an uncaring winds. "Calves are easily bound and slaughtered, never knowing the reason why," she sang. "But whoever treasures freedom, like the swallow, must learn to fly." She sang a song he rather liked about a mine caving in Nova Scotia. She played the same thin strum on the guitar for that one that she had played for the others. But Jeff could hear in the song itself how the guitar might sound behind the melody line, how it should sound strong and rhythmic. For all their lives they dug a grave, 2 miles of earth for a marking stone, 2 miles of earth for a marking stone. The guitar didn't sound so good, but Melody's voice, low and sweet, holding on to the notes, poured over him. She sang as if she believed each and every word. Her eyes shone with sincerity, and she curved over the instrument like a flower bending in the wind. Jeff watched and listened, basking in his own feelings, of being with his own mother, who wrapped her love around him, of being, strange as it seemed, home, where he was welcome, of waking up to a world where his help was needed to right what was wrong, of lying on the soft grass under trees hundreds of years old, beside walls that his ancestors had built, of being loggy with the perfumed heat of the day. Melody had to go out to a party that night. She piled her hair on top of her head, put on a lacy blouse and a long patchwork skirt, and kissed Jeff goodnight. "I have to go," she said. He didn't mind and said so. "See you in the morning," she said, her hand lingering on the top of his head, just as his eyes lingered on the place where she had been standing long after she had gone out the door. He sat with Jambo and the 2 aunts in a living room dominated by a big color television set. Jambo held the remote control box in her hand and turned the sound down so that she could talk with Jeff, who sat beside her on a satin-covered love seat. The 2 aunts had straight-back chairs drawn up close to the television screen. "You're a Beaudralt, and you don't even know what that means," Jambo said. "There's so much to tell you." Jeff looked alert and concentrated on not being distracted by the moving figures on the screen at the corner of his vision. Jambo folded her hands on her lap. The large diamond ring she wore on her left hand glittered. On her right hand, a ring of small diamonds surrounded a flat green stone. Her eyes followed Jeff's glance. "An heirloom." She held out her right hand for Jeff to look more closely at the ring. "My great-grandmother's engagement ring, made to order here in Charleston. She loved jade. Her collection of jade figurines is in the bank now. The cost of insuring is prohibitive, over 60 pieces, each exquisite. The goldsmith worked her initial into the setting, but you can only see that under a magnifying glass, the letter D. They say the goldsmith was in love with her. Of course, everybody was. She was a great beauty in her day. We had a portrait, but like so much else, it has been lost to us. I never saw her. She died young in childbirth. But this ring my grandmother left to my mother to me, Dolores. Her name was Dolores. This other," she held up her left hand, "was my engagement ring, and I always wear it. But the jade is dearer to me as the years go on. He was killed, you know, in the First War, and I was left with my memories and the one child, just as Melody's poor father was killed in the Second War. The Beaudralt women have married young. They have not been fortunate in their marriages, not fortunate at all." Her voice was dry, cracked like fine china after years of wear. She went on until Jeff had the sense of family spreading out around them endlessly. And only an hour later, when she was lost in reminiscences, did he understand that the names she had mentioned, the people she spoke of, were most of them long ago dead. The family spread out, not out and around, but back into time. At last she looked at him and said, I feel As if I can pour myself into you, everything I've learned, everything I know, and you will take it on into your life." Then she rose and withdrew from the room. The aunts, only they weren't aunts, Jeff remembered, but cousins from different branches of the family, remained where they were, staring into the television, chattering like birds themselves. Jeff, too, went upstairs to bed. In his room, he changed to pajamas, folded his clothes neatly into drawers, putting soiled socks and underwear away. He went down to the bathroom, peed, lowered the toilet seat, brushed his teeth, then washed his face so that he could have the pleasure of drying it on the thick, soft towel. The night was too warm for even a sheet. There was something about the house and the women in it that made him feel contented, as if to be contented was something you actually did. He thought lazily that he would figure out what it was and lay back on the softness of the bed, under the dark air, but he fell asleep. After the first couple of days, Jeff didn't see much of his mother, unless she took him with her to a meeting or to help with stuffing envelopes or distributing posters. But her presence marked the day for him. She knew somehow what he wanted her to do or say, as if she could read his mind and know how he was feeling. It wasn't that Melody did exactly what he wanted to do, but that everything she did made him feel good, feel loved. It was as if she could see what he saw the way he saw it, as if they were close, even when they weren't actually together. Whenever they were together, her eyes shone with affection and pride. He knew he was doing the right things for her, learning about discrimination and pollution, being no trouble to Miss Opal, who praised him for his personal neatness, good appetite, and gentlemanly manners. Jambo talked to him until Jeff had pieced together the names and events so that he could follow her conversation and ask her the questions she wanted to answer. The aunts seldom spoke, but he was conscious of their admiring and improving eyes. During the days, he wandered around the historic parts of the city, or traveled by bus to scenic spots beyond its industrialized outer ring, to see plantations and gardens. He had, in the first days with Melody, spent all of his money, even the $4 left from Brother Thomas's $10, when she bought the most expensive possible bottle of local wine for him. However, he found that Jambo was more than happy to finance an expedition. If he told her at breakfast how much he needed, she would take out her black change purse and give him the dollars he asked for. Jeff learned the songs Melody liked until he could sing with her, and in the late afternoons or on evenings when she was at home, they sang together. She started to teach him how to play the guitar, then didn't have time, so gave him the books she had used. He spent long hours with the instrument, conscious as he held it that she, too, had so held it. He placed his hands where she had placed hers, and could almost feel the imprint her hands had left, warmth beneath his own. His sense of contentment continued and became the tone of every day. He listened and learned. Even Miss Opal had stories to tell him of growing up in the old city and the life of the black communities on the nearby islands. Miss Opal lived now in a public housing apartment with her grandson, Willem, whom she raised since he was 5, when his parents both moved up north to take better jobs. Willem was in high school and gave his grandmother a deal of trouble. Miss Opal didn't complain about Willem. This was the way men were, she seemed to say. You had to give a young man plenty of freedom. When the devil got into Willem, she prayed for him and chuckled over the scrapes he got into and saw to it that he was punished too. Miss Opal called him Jefferson, as did Jambo and the aunts. His mother called him Jeffy. He had asked her what he should call her, and she told him Melody, because I'm your mother, but I really want to be your friend. Her name, Melody, sang within him like the music he could sometimes win out of her guitar. The slow days passed. Jeff passed through them, a beau dwelt in his own country. Their general history was his own history too. The story of his own family was a part of the history. His ancestors, all the Beaudrop men, had stepped in their long boots where he stepped now, or riding tall horses. Jeff knew when July turned to August and the long August weeks went by that he would soon be going back to Baltimore. But even as the day of his return grew closer, he could not imagine it. In his final week, he took to traveling farther out from the city. He rode the bus down around John's Island, then once all the way to the end of the southern line. The bus stopped at the crossroads by a general store. Jeff got off and walked, heading away from the city, passing rickety houses up on cinder blocks where clothes blew in a steady breeze, crossing between long fields of vegetables, walking under a tunnel of live oaks that arched over the roadway, where Spanish moss hung down like furry icicles. The trees were not tall and straight like the great northern oaks, but bent and convoluted. Their leaves grew small and thick, the hanging moss draped down from them melancholy, but not heavy. Jeff walked on and on. He came at last to a broad marsh, through which a narrow creek cut. Beyond it, a line of low trees, palms and pines, marked on one side one of the sea islands. If he had a boat, Jeff thought, he would like to go over and explore the island. It stretched as far as he could see beyond the marsh. It looked like a different world. It looked tropical. It was late in the afternoon when he returned that day, but nobody questioned him. Nobody criticized his dusty legs or long, unexplained absence. Melody had gone out to a cocktail party and would not be back until much later in the evening. He was in time for dinner, so Jambo and the aunts had not been disturbed. They did not even ask him where he had been, what he had been doing, as if whatever he had done, wherever, must, because he was himself, be as it should. The next day, Melody took him to the bus. She had exchanged his airline ticket for a bus ticket, saying the professor had no sense of money, that there were better uses for the extra dollars. Jeff's bus, which left Charleston at 5 in the evening, would take 16 hours to make the journey to Baltimore. They stood beside the big greyhound saying goodbye. With his eyes, Jeff drank in his mother's face. She held both of his hands in hers, her beautiful gray eyes filled with tears. "You never met Max, and he wanted to meet you," she said. Jeff didn't know what to say. "I've been so proud of you, Jeffy, and you've been happy, haven't you?" Jeff agreed, although happy wasn't the word he would have chosen to express the wonder of the summer. The driver leaned down and urged Jeff onto the bus. Melody wrapped her arms around him and kissed his hair. "You have money?" she asked him. Jeff shook his head. "And I don't have any with me," she wailed. "Oh, Jeffy, what a bad mother I've been." Jeff smiled at her. "No, you aren't, Melody," he said. "Doesn't make any difference. I won't starve to death in a few hours." He had to climb onto the bus, then, and find a seat. By the time he was settled by a window, she was gone. Jeff sat alone toward the back of the bus beside the window. Few other people rode on it. The bus went west on the highway out of Charleston. Once they had left the city, they were traveling through a scrub pine forest, and then, as they turned to head north over flat lands, flat fields, flat marshes, little flat ponds up against the highway, slowly the late afternoon light faded into golden shades of sunset, going from Charleston, which lay behind him, to Baltimore, which waited ahead. Jeff felt not so much that he was traveling as that he had occupied one single place, which rested between the other two. He looked out the window. It was not simply going from a warm to a colder climate, or from his mother to his father. It was going from one self to another. In Charleston, he was Jeffy, Jefferson, Melody's son, the last in a long line of Beaudralt men. In Baltimore, he was Jeff Green, self-sufficient and reticent, no trouble at all, occupying his corner of the world. But he knew now how it felt to be loved, to be happy. The bus rumbled on. One of the small ponds came up into view. A solitary blue heron stood at its edge, half hidden in the pale marsh grass. The heron's legs were like stilts under its clumsy body. Its dusky feathers hung shaggy, ungroomed. It was perfectly motionless. Its long beak pointed down from a head both unnoble and unbeautiful. Its beak aimed down into the still, dark water. The heron occupied its own insignificant corner of the landscape in a timeless, long-legged solitude. The bus swept past the pond. After a while, the sun completed its setting and darkness came beyond the windows. A darkness lit by the occasional farmhouse window, the occasional crossroads, the occasional sign, the occasional town. Jeff sang melody songs to himself under his breath, under the rumble of the motor. He thought that someday, maybe, he would have to choose between his parents, the two of them. At the thought, his heart beat painfully in anticipation. He knew who he would choose. He knew why, and he said her name.